Hello, hello. This is Alex Burkett, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Shanelle Mullin. Shanelle is the experimentation and analysis lead at Shopify. She's also my friend and former coworker from my days working at CXL. We spent years in the trenches, writing and editing each other's work, learning conversion optimization and experimentation and data analysis, and sharing those learnings with the world. Or at least the small fraction of the world that cares about Bayesian versus frequentist statistics, anyway. So obviously this conversation was super fun. And we talked about the worlds of content and writing, as well as the worlds of experimentation and CRO, which is really a unique opportunity to do so, since she and I are probably among the few that work across both of those areas. We talked about impatience as a virtue, what we miss about working at CXL, hint, high standards, and the ability to explore our curiosities and get paid for it. Leadership lessons and how to carve out companies and cultures that allow this sort of curiosity exploration and experimentation, and how poetry and songwriting factor into work-life balance and fuel creativity. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Shanelle Mullin. What do you miss about working at CXL?
That's a good question. I feel like I miss the influence of Pep. Mm-hmm. Probably. Like, I feel like he had a very high standard for everything. And I think going into that role, I thought that I also internally had a high standard for myself. And now I feel like it's been switched out internally for like a little mini Pep who asks me, would you publish this?
Do you still have that? Tommy Walker says that he's got like a little editorial voice in his head that resembles Pep's editorial voice.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. It applies to everything, I think. Is like anytime I'm about to like hit send on something, I'm like, would I have sent this to Pep? I don't know if he intended to forever be in my brain this way, but he appears to be.
It's an interesting anecdote on leadership, because I think it's something that not a lot of people think about. But for me, at least, like that's what I miss as well, was the high standards and high expectations. But I feel like a lot of management practices today are kind of centered around, I don't want to say the opposite, but it's more so like a nourishing, a softness, a complementary, like very, very complementary nature, as opposed to really holding somebody up to the bar that they want to be held up to. So it's kind of interesting. Like I wonder sometimes if I'm losing that like high standard for myself, and like how I kind of maintain that in my head. Have you felt any sort of like creeping, loss of that high standard that you had at CXL?
I don't think so. Like, I think that a big part of my career has been, a big part of my success in my career has been getting to largely choose the people that I work for. And I very deliberately look for people who have those high standards, but then also, to your point, like kind of that softness. Like, I think I prefer working with people who lead with kindness, but also have high standards. I think that a lot of the times people think it's in opposition to one another, but I think that you can be a very, kind, caring person who advocates for the people who work for them. And then also, hold their craft quality to a high standard.
Yeah, totally. Are you at Shopify right now? What are you working on? Are you leading a team, or what's your day in the life right now?
Yeah, so I'm an experimentation and analysis lead. And so I lead the experimentation pod. It's a strategy and ops team. So we're doing like strategy, foundation, operations, analysis, the foundational thinking around experimentation and how the growth teams can use that as a vehicle for CRO and any form of optimization.
Does that mean that you guys own the tech stack as well? Like, are you in charge of the, I don't know if you use Google Analytics or Optimizely or kind of whatever like MarTech stack you guys have? Is that like in your purview as well, kind of the tooling?
We sit at a super interesting intersection of like data science, engineering, and marketing. And we kind of coordinate with all three of those areas, which is interesting context switching. So I don't know that I would say we own the tech stack, but I would say that we work closely with the engineering team and the data science team to improve and consult on how we use technology to experiment.
Yeah, your team sounds. I mean, I've talked to Morgan Brown about like the team structure at Shopify, and like I don't think there's any sort of perfect org structure, but it sounds like you guys have set up your at least growth and experimentation programs in a really ideal way. Like it's kind of your team is kind of like the center of excellence, correct? Like you're going to help and enable other teams in their experimentation, not necessarily just centralize all of the CRO and all of the efforts through you guys.
Yeah, exactly. When we first started, it was more centralized, and it was our team kind of coming up with the experiments and designing them and launching them and then analyzing them. And we were borrowing dev resourcing and we were borrowing design resourcing from wherever we could get it. And then, especially with Morgan Brown's influence and different leaders' influence, experimentation has a ton of buy-in at Shopify and is becoming more and more useful and used. And so we had to rapidly decentralize the way that we did experimentation. And we kind of worked ourselves out of the role of being the person who does every element of the process of an experiment to kind of being the center of excellence model. And it's been really interesting because I've never worked at a company at this stage of experimentation maturity in this role before. I've never had to bridge the gap between a small experimentation program and a large experimentation program. And it's been very interesting problems to consider.
So how does that look? How does that exhibit itself? Like, would you, are you kind of focused on like the processes, guardrails, QA checklists, like basically the best practices by which somebody experiments, and then you just sort of like educate and hand those off to those teams? Or would it say like an email team or like a product team comes to you and they're like, hey, we want to like learn how to basically wrap experimentation up into our, our sprint process? Like, and would you guys actually handhold and like run the first couple experiments and teach them? Or I guess concretely, what does this look like when you're working with other teams, and how do you actually support and enable them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of earlier this year when we were starting to decentralize, it was a lot more of just straight up education. We, built a live workshop and we air quotes tricked everyone into coming to said workshop so that we could quickly get everyone on growth up to speed on the basics of experimentation. And now I would say it's more moving into an embedding model where we'll work really closely with some of the growth teams and we are more hands-on with them and we kind of show them the process. We talk to them about the strategy behind the process. We talk to them about, the science and the math behind the processes, so that they can eventually go off on their own. So it's an interesting balance of directly supporting growth marketing teams. And then also we have a lot of foundational things that we work on separate of the growth teams. My cat is here. Separate of the growth teams. So it's an interesting balance between those two objectives and figuring out, is it 50% with the growth teams embedding, or is it 75%? And how do we leave time for the problems that affect everyone or will eventually affect everyone that we can foresee?
Gotcha. So I have a question on the education side. So my day job, apart from this agency that I'm running, is basically managing the experimentation program and team and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And I have found that I like through the years that I spent working at CXL, I feel like I built up such a large backlog of like theoretical knowledge. Like I've got kind of an esoteric library in my brain of like, oh, this is when you would run a non-inferiority test, or like sequential testing, or like there's just so much kind of esoteria in my brain. And then coming in like, and because one of my main jobs is educating essentially on kind of the data side and experimentation side. And it's been kind of difficult transmitting that knowledge without like overwhelming people. So I guess like my question is, did you face something similar? Spending, years and years working with PEP, who has these high standards, and basically like CXL set the standard for the industry in many ways, evangelized how to do experimentation and CRO on the marketing side. Was it hard for you to come in and act as an educator, or do you think that it actually improved your ability to do so? Because I feel like a lot of people come in and maybe what an A/B test is loosely, but just the level to which we were researching was pretty in the weeds.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I think it's interesting because I didn't do formal education in any capacity, and I kind of learned what I needed to learn specific for the jobs that I was trying to do. I always felt, I think I've said this to you multiple times, that I think you tackled a lot of the scientific mathematical topics, where I took like the psychology, copywriting type topics more often. And so I kind of picked up what I needed to from courses and books and data scientists at Shopify adopting me and teaching me after work how to do certain things. And so I think I had to learn things in a very simplistic way. I don't think I learned them in the formal theoretical way. I learned them very applicably. And so I think that maybe made it a little bit easier for me to explain it. I feel like when I'm writing an article, I always try to think of how I wish someone had explained it to me. And I think also a thing that I know is inaccessible to me as someone who doesn't have a formal background in math or data is a lot of the terminology trips me up when I'm reading a textbook or something. I'm like, I don't know what this concept is because I didn't take this class in, undergrad or something like that. And so I think I kind of know what to look for sometimes and what might trip people up. But to your point, I'm often going through things multiple times, and my team or I are asking questions like, what is this? Even if we know, most people may not know, especially given we're a technical team and most of growth is not considered a technical team.
Yeah. You mentioned that you tricked people in the first round of like education. I'm curious, how did you trick people into getting educated, and how do you continue to compel people when it may not be their day job, that may not be in their job description? How do you bring people to be interested in learning about experimentation and data? What are the internal marketing levers that you pull there?
Yeah, so we used a lot of cats in our presentation, and we put a lot of jokes in there. So that was part of the trick. But I was kind of alluding to the fact that we more or less signed people up to to take the workshop. We just went through team by team. We're like, content team, please come to our workshop, and invited them all to the event. But fortunately, I think once you have the buy-in from leadership, the experimentation culture just starts to come along. And I've always read that in blog articles. I think I've written blog articles about how important the culture is, but it was really interesting to see it actually happen at Shopify, of going from like everything felt like an uphill battle, and we were, desperate for resources. And I was trying to like prove that CRO was important when I was doing a more CRO role. And now, there's an entire team that just does optimization. And it hasn't been that long compared to how long I've been trying to do experimentation at Shopify. And so I think once that culture came along, everything just felt easier. Do
you think that's a function of Morgan and other leaders coming in and like really having that understanding and evangelizing it from the top down, in conjunction with the work that you'd been doing, bottoms up, and kind of educating other teams cross-functionally? Or how do you attribute, like, I guess, that growth of interest in culture of experimentation?
I think so. Yeah, I think part of it was kind of like brute force coming through of like, this is important, we should try it. I know Hannah Abaza early on was also like, we should try this at Shopify Plus. And then, it kind of took off a little bit. But definitely in terms of resourcing, it's leadership is who comes through. But I also think it's like, as you start launching experiments and as you start building a body of insights, I think what I saw happen was like, we became the insights people. People were like, what should we do now? And it wasn't so much about the actual experiments that you had run in their minds. It was, what insights do you have? And I think that was how I saw experimentation early on, before Morgan Brown and that leadership team came in. That was kind of first how I started seeing experimentation gain traction internally.
That's such a mature way to view experimentation. I was talking to Ben LeBay the other day. We did like a CRO meetup happy hour thing, and he puts out like all this great content on LinkedIn nowadays. One of his most recent ones was on the phases of an experimentation program and how it's often backwards. So it should start with like kind of learning how to experiment, like setting up guardrails, guidelines, best practices. So you actually know how to run a proper experiment. You've got the data in place. The second phase is basically being the customer insights team. So knowing more about the customer and the user than anyone else, teaching that and expanding the learning and insights to other teams. And then finally, once you've got those two out of the way, it's like, then you start to test to win. Then you start looking at win rates and like percentage wins and all of that stuff. But it seems like it's mostly backwards in most companies. And I'm not totally sure if this is a question or why that is, but it does seem like there's some misconception. And for some reason, y'all at Shopify have actually had a more mature understanding of the value of experimentation.
Yeah. It's been really delightful, regardless of who the leadership team has been. It's always seemed like there's been buy-in for the insights that come out of experimentation, which is great, because I think that the alternative is that people are very focused on the wins, and we all know that most tests lose, and most tests aren't designed in a way that you will learn something regardless of the outcome, which I think is also a common mistake. But it's been really delightful getting to work in a company where people care about what we're learning, and we're looking to build a body of insights and a body of knowledge, not just looking at the velocity and the win rate and going from each individual experiment.
Yeah. So this is my new struggle is trying to compute that and communicate that internally, and also maybe starting to explore some of the industry wide stuff too, because I think a lot of the conversation was around win rates and stuff like that in the past. But when you described it like that, how most tests fail, it's I don't think that's understood. I think a lot of programs have the expectation because of case studies out in the industry of like 300% wins and all this stuff that, you really should be chasing those things, but you end up on a treadmill of disappointment if you're actually rigorous in your experimentation, or you start, cherry picking and lying about results, which is obviously the worst case scenario. But in your case, it's like, instead of the treadmill of disappointment, you've got sort of a flywheel of learning, a flywheel of insights. And that flywheel kind of builds interest in the program, spits out wins here and there, and it grows over time in value, as opposed to the other one where it's this constant drip, this constant expectation of like, all right, where's the next win? Where are we going to get it from? And it's like expecting kind of magic bullets.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think, to your point, it definitely creates a culture for where those oversights can happen. I would be suspicious if a win rate was too high. I'm like, are we, choosing the metric after the experiment is concluded because we like that's what we want on and we want this to look good. Yeah. So I think that if you are prioritizing the win side of things, it's going to incentivize bad behavior, for lack of a better expression.
Yeah. Switching it up. So in the past, you called yourself a Jill of all trades.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is maybe a controversial opinion, but I don't think that experimentation or CRO are a specialty in the sense that most people talk about specialties. In fact, I actually think that most of our industry and marketing really abuses the term specialist versus generalist. Mm-hmm. But I'm curious about how you view yourself now, because it seems like you've really dug down that tunnel of experimentation and conversion rate optimization. So do you still look at yourself as a generalist, a Jill of all trades? Do you look at yourself as a specialist? Do you think CRO is a specialty, or is it a combination of like 6 different specialties, and you could go down each of those paths, like copywriting, design, statistics, etc.? There's like 6 questions. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I think to answer the one of them, I think that CRO is not a specialty. I think it's a nice label for a bunch of disciplines that are related to one another. And like, for example, we were both writing about CRO for years, and I feel like we covered drastically different topics. And I still consider myself a generalist, because I've been down the CRO experimentation path for maybe 4 or 5 years now. No, just kidding. 5 to 6 years. What is time? But like before that, I think that I would have identified more closely with content. And then before that, I would have identified more closely with affiliate marketing. I think what I like about marketing is that there's so many different things you can learn. And I feel like it makes me better at each area that I kind of venture down for a while, that I have an understanding of many of the other areas, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. So we're on the same page, but the industry seems to glorify specialists. I think it's a Nassim Taleb quote. I can't remember if it was him or not, but specialization is for ants. And humans are not meant to go down these narrow pathways. But I can also see this opposing argument, which is, being a specialist, especially if you're trying to grow your career, personal brand, or if in any sense you're doing like content promotion or social media stuff, like being known for something very specific helps. So I could make the argument maybe that I've made some sacrifices by not specializing, because I mean, literally right now I run an experimentation program and I also run a content marketing agency. So how do I reconcile those two when I'm talking on social media or my email list? It's like, I can't seem to close one of the doors because I like the other one so much. So do you feel like you've sacrificed anything by maintaining that generalism? Do you sometimes wish that you had specialized in one of these areas, or how do you feel about that?
I think that people chose a specialization for me, which is interesting. Like I think people in the industry really latched on to what I did at CXL. Often when I'm like, oh, I'm at Shopify now, they're like, oh, how's that going? I'm like, great, it's been 4 years. And and I still think that in the marketing industry, I am most closely associated with the work that I did at CXL. And so I often think that I'm closely associated with content and CRO, or maybe more so CRO, despite the fact that I did that professionally for maybe a year and a half at Shopify before I switched to like the foundational work with experimentation, which I think is much different than CRO, or at least the way that it's set up in Shopify. It's much different.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that people still to this day like look back on your work at CXL and that's kind of how they define you. Because it's been the same for me. I was playing this game with a friend the other day called First, Last, Best, Worst. Have you heard of this? Is this ringing any bells? So I'm reading this book called Storyworthy. It's all about kind of like how to tell and how to craft stories from a personal perspective, not necessarily from writing or like, movie production or something like that. It's more so if we were just talking in a bar or something like that. Mm-hmm. So one of the first part of the book is all about like, it's saying like you have way more stories in your life than you actually know. And it's kind of giving you methodologies for finding those stories. And one of those is basically you take a bunch of categories and you say your first, last, best, and worst of those. And we were talking about jobs, and I had to say, like, I love what I'm doing now. HubSpot was amazing. The agency's great. But I actually said the best job was CXL simply because it formed the basis for so much of my career and personal brand, and gave me so much leverage in those areas. Because people still to this day, when I'm on sales calls for the agency, people are like, yeah, man, I followed your work at CXL. It's like, it sounds like you've got something similar. Do you miss that? Or like, do you think is that something you chase or try to replicate? Like, that next experience that has that foundational, that high degree of leverage like the CXL time did?
I think so. Yeah. Like the only reason I stopped working at CXL was because I didn't want to work from home anymore. Or I didn't want to be like a remote employee in a non-remote company. Otherwise, I think that I likely would still be there. I loved working there. And I think that much like you, I think about it as the highest growth period of my career. And I definitely want to replicate those types of opportunities. But it's interesting to figure out how to do that. Like, how do you, I guess when I reached out about working at CXL, I did kind of, suspect that it could be a big opportunity. Like, I wanted specifically to work with PEP. I specifically wanted to work with CXL. But I'm not sure that I've ever come across another opportunity that I've been like as sure of from the very beginning of like, this will be something something big. But weirdly, when I was in it and we were, we were like sending each other blog posts at 8 a.m. because we had just finished and we needed someone to edit it. And it was going live in an hour. It didn't feel like something monumental was happening to me.
Mm-hmm.
But looking back, 5 years later, it definitely was a huge, impactful part of my life.
It is interesting how, I totally agree. It felt mundane at the time, but in retrospect, it's like, wow, like the connections we made at conferences and through our blog posts and all that stuff, it really did make a lasting impact. And I wonder too, if like that mundanity, is that a word? That mundane nature could also be playing out right now. And in 5 years, we look back and we actually say the same thing about the experiences we're going through.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because I think that when I was younger, I thought that everything was going to feel like a moment, and that everything was going to feel more polished. And I'd be like, yes, I know what I'm doing. But like all of the industry connections that I made at CXL were like people I was hanging out with at the bar after the conference. Like nothing ever felt like a moment when I was in the moment. And that now looking back and I'm like, wow, that was the moment. And it led to all of these other good things, which I think is something I've thought about a lot lately. I thought it was supposed to feel a lot more polished and purposeful than anything has really felt.
Have you, so this idea of like experience them or contextualizing the moment as you're experiencing it. I think it was Virginia Woolf that had this paragraph or this exercise called Moments of Being, in which she actually does embody like this awareness of what she's going through. And she knows that with a assuredness that in the future, this is going to be something that does change her life, or like she does look back on. It sounds like you didn't experience that at CXL, but maybe it has happened to you before. Do you, do you find those moments in your daily life now? Like, do you find yourself thinking like, all right, this is going to be one of those moments, and like in your career, can you identify some of those like in the past, year or two, that you're like, all right, this is something here?
I honestly don't think I can. I feel like a lot of the times my internal experience is like, I'm just winging it and I'm out here doing my best. And then we'll do like an impact review 6 months later. I'm like, wow, look at all those great things that felt like just winging it. And I don't know if it's like internal self-deprecation or what, but it definitely, to me, feels like I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants. And then I think it's like in reflection is when I realize, no, this was, it was a journey. It just didn't feel like a linear journey at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, it's the same. I can feel it sometimes, and sometimes I'm wrong on this, but when I make big decisions, like when I quit HubSpot to go work for a startup, or when I quit CXL to work for HubSpot, the most recent time I felt this, that I knew in the future that I would look back on this moment as something profound, was when I did mushrooms. But that's completely unrelated to business stuff. But it's like very few and far between. Like maybe, I'm speaking at a big conference. Like I can sometimes look at that as a moment that's going to change me. But it's usually the much more subtle things that end up producing big career wins and big career changes. And I think those are incredibly hard to identify. I wanted to just bring it back a little bit. So we were talking about generalism versus, specializing, and you're working deeply in experimentation now. I still look at you as one of the best writers I know, in terms of like quality and like your writing chops. Do you still keep that sword sharp? Do you do any freelance writing, or like what's the current state of writing in Shanelle's world?
I did do freelance writing a few times, and I burnt myself out on it a little bit, and it was because I didn't really plan going into it. I'm like, oh, I will take on this one client, and then I got excited about all the opportunities, and before you know it, I had 8, and I'm like, I can't do this. Why did I do this? And so I think because I went into freelance writing more than once, without preparing or without purpose, just kind of thinking it would be a side hobby, I got a little burnt out on it for a couple of years. But it's definitely something I'm interested in doing again soon. I would want to make sure that I did it with purpose this time around, and I had a plan, so I didn't look up in 6 months and be like, how did all these people get here?
Yeah. I mean, the burnout thing is real, and I often overbook myself, but I'm particularly scared about burning myself out with something like writing because it's given me so much like enrichment in other areas. Mm-hmm. So that is something that I look into. Do you keep a writing practice that's non-monetary, non-freelance oriented? Like, do you do any like journaling exercises or writing on a personal blog or anything like that?
Yeah, I journal pretty regularly, which is kind of a new thing that I've been doing, and I've been using it for self-reflection because I did realize that so much of my realizations come in reflection. I'm like, maybe I should reflect more than once every 6 months. So I've been doing that in an attempt to kind of realize those moments as they're happening, or at least not so far after, or not so long after they've happened. And I also write poetry that I don't publish anywhere. I'm trying very hard to maintain hobbies that are not monetized, which is very difficult for me because I can't stop thinking like I could be making money. Like people do this and they get money for it. Why would I not be doing that? But also then all of my hobbies start to look like my work and then I get burnt out. And so I write music and I write poetry in my spare time.
All right, yeah, let's dive into some of this because I love this concept. I am such a type A, like Enneagram 3 personality, where I try to monetize all of my hobbies. So I've developed I call it non-teleological hobbies. So it's like without aim, right? Like without any like end result. So I loved learning Spanish. I didn't really have any goals with it. I wasn't going to make more money on it. Music has been the ultimate one. And I've recently got back into it over the pandemic, which has actually been a really nice silver lining. But I go to the extent with this stuff because I do wrap myself up in my work too much, where I have to come up with just novel, extremely novel hobbies where it's like there's no possible way you could actually look at this as pragmatic. Like I've been getting into magic tricks recently. So I go on YouTube and I learn how to do magic tricks. So it sounds like music is that for you. It sounds like poetry is that for you. Have you developed any other weird ones where it's like, all right, there's not a way that I can monetize this? Like, do you go kayaking? Like, what's the outside life outside of work?
I play a lot of video games. I'm going to be honest with you. I read a lot. I play a lot of video games. And I also accidentally got super into tarot and astrology.
Oh, no way.
Like Christmas of 2019. I was so bored. I was sitting in my parents' house and I just went through so much documentation on how to like read a birth chart and like all of the planets and the houses that they're in. And it's just like accidentally become a part of my personality that I did not foresee or intend to happen. So it's
how did you even get into that?
Well, because I always knew that I was an Aries, which I like people have told me, they're like, that's what this means. And like, that doesn't sound like me. Like they're angry and like super impatient and like very high strung. And I think despite my type A tendencies, I'm a fairly laid back person. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like me. And so I kind of just like went into it being like, why do so many people think this is a thing when I feel like it's so obviously wrong. And then I learned about all the different placements and what they're supposed to mean. But in actuality, I use that also kind of like as a reflection tool of like, what of this do I see in myself and what do I not? And I think it's good for introspection, much like tarot.
Do you use poetry as a reflection tool as well, or what's the utility of that for you?
Yeah, I think so. I generally will get like a feeling of some sort, and then I will start with a line, and then I'll build the entire poem around the line, and then usually I will take the poetry and put that over music because I cannot write songs I can't sit down and compose and then also write lyrics over top of it. It just does not make sense in that order for my brain for some reason. I have
so to. So you do lyrics first and then music?
Yeah.
I'm totally the opposite. I'm trying to write music again. It's been years since I've tried it, but Sorry, there's another framework that I got to bring up. It's plotters versus pantsers. So my friend is a writer, and she's talking about how there's kind of like gardeners and architects, people who plan out the entire book from start to finish, and the people who basically start writing and figure it out as they go. And I've tried to do it in layers or strategies, like outline a song, think about like the theme, the key that it's in, all of this stuff, like, melody. But when it comes down to it, I have to just kind of like sit down, come up with a cool riff, and basically just sing some like, generic like gobbledygook over it, like just like nonsense. And then once I have that, then I sit down and actually write the lyrics and make them make sense. But it sounds like yours is somewhat backwards to that.
Yeah, and I think based on the YouTube videos I've watched about like how to compose music, because I don't know how. I think my cousin taught me how to play guitar when I was a kid, but I don't I've never taken a class or anything. So it was like watching YouTube videos to figure out how to write music, and all of them describe your method. And I was like, I can't do that. I'm trying so hard. I also play bass, and that's all I have right now, which I find very hard to write music on. So I think it helps to have the lyrics first for that reason as well.
Yeah. Well, you've got to take the path of less friction. I feel like there's a lot of like shoulds in terms of like, here's how you should come up with an A/B test idea. Here's how you should outline your article for SEO. Here's how you should write a song. But it's like oftentimes those ideas, those methods don't work for me. So like trying to fit my square peg into the round hole of like the industry shoulds is like just not effective. And especially true with creative stuff. It's like, if you're going to do this for enjoyment, like there's no reason you should actually just like force yourself to do things because other people do it this way.
Right. Exactly. Like I'm not going to, cut an album or anything anytime soon. So I figure you might as well just do it in the way that feels good to you.
So one thing that I'm noting is like, you've got a pretty good yin and yang here. Like you think a lot about reflection and also drive. So like, it seems like you're pretty well balanced there. And then also like your reflection oriented activities are all somewhat creative in nature. So that do you think that actually does factor into some of your work? Like indirectly speaking, it's sort of a reflection period that gives you the mental rest that allows for your creativity to flourish when it does come down to, to driving and working in like the actual, the yang side, the work side of your life.
Yeah, I think so. And it's also interesting when they kind of interact. Like I remember Jason Naidu was the director of growth at Shopify for a while. And I published an article at CXL while I was at Shopify. And he joked that I was giving away all of our secrets because it was about SaaS retention optimization. And I was like, no, like I just learned all those things as I was writing the article. Like they were things that were happening and my brain knew, but they were all separate. And writing the article kind of brought them together in a cohesive way that was easy for me to then like turn around and tell people as a process, if that makes sense. And so I think it's interesting when the creative parts like writing mix with the professional parts.
So that is super interesting. And that's kind of what I was going to go into with regards to the writing stuff and keeping the sword sharp. I use writing. I mean, by and large nowadays, the writing that I actually do myself, not through like agency and clients and freelancers and all that stuff, I use it as a thinking tool and oftentimes to communicate ideas to other people. Like I've got this idea in my head right now, and I started writing the article on the concept of decentralized content marketing. So typically you're going to go through a process like a centralized content team. You're going to work with SEO to establish keywords. There's going to be strict brand guidelines and an editorial calendar. And then you'll probably promote it through like company channels. Mm-hmm. But I'm seeing more now like this idea of smaller teams who need to be agile and cover more ground, of establishing some general company principles, but then letting people pull from a pool of ideas and build up their own followings. And then sometimes there's audience crossover, sometimes there's not. So I just had this word in my head, decentralized content marketing. But then when I started writing the article, it became clearer and clearer to me how this actually looks in the real world and what are the limitations and who's it for. And it basically crystallized this whole idea for me. It's not done yet, but I think that's a really big tool for writing for me. And oftentimes when I'm trying to communicate ideas to the team at Workato, I'll write like what is essentially an article before I ever, set up the meeting or communicate, because I need to clarify it to myself. So do you still do this like internally? Do you still, write like it's not a blog post, but do you still do like a memo or something like that? And, if it's not as a big a part of your life now, like, do you kind of miss that in terms of like that modality you had for crystallizing ideas, like the SAS retention example you gave?
Yeah, I still do it to an extent, just for myself personally. I write a lot in notebooks. I joke frequently that I am better in writing than in person. And I definitely feel like, in a meeting, if people are asking for concepts or ideas or suggestions, it's much more likely that my best thought is going to come after when I can write it down, and think through all the thoughts I had in the meeting. And so if I'm going into a big meeting, or I'm trying to present a concept to people, I will typically, whether or not I present the deck or present the doc, I will have written it out beforehand so that I know my thinking around it. But I do miss, this is like not quite as related, but I do miss writing. I think I've gotten a little bit busier, and also content is not my main role anymore. And so it's easier for me to do podcasts and to do speaking gigs to kind of get my thoughts and ideas and maintain a personal brand than it is to write. And I definitely miss writing because I think I'm just objectively better at it than I am speaking. But also B, I think that it is more crystallizing, I think is a good word that you used. I think is easier for me to crystallize my thoughts than when speaking conversationally about something.
Did you, when you were at CXL or when you were freelancing, did you still look at writing on a certain level as a process of crystallizing your ideas or exploring ideas, or was it more functional?
I think I did at CXL, and then I think eventually I reached a point where the topics that people wanted to cover were for SEO, and I'm like, I wrote a very similar article. I still feel like it was the best way that I could have written the article. I don't know. I don't know how to write it better. And so I feel like I kind of also got burnt out in that sense of like, I don't know how to write a better article on this keyword. And I was kind of competing against myself on keywords. But at CXL, I did feel like it was like an exploratory, digging into something, doing research, talking to industry experts, getting their feedback, thinking about how that mixed with the research that I had done, what my own thoughts were, what Pep's thoughts were, what your thoughts were, and kind of like, it felt like often that I ended up with a paper more than a blog article.
Yeah, it's interesting. A couple notes there. So I've got this kind of duality going on right now where it's like business-wise, like SEO is a great channel. For content, it's super predictable. It's how many companies can win. But I do think at a certain level, SEO degrades the soul of a writer. And I've certainly felt that. Like now that I'm looking at keywords all the time, sometimes I even look at my own content. And instead of just writing the damn piece in the way that I want to, I'm like, well, how do I actually attach a keyword to this and like put it through ClearScope and blah, 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 blah. And it kind of ruins it a little bit in my head. But you and I feel like maybe towards the end, we looked at keywords a little bit, but through our time at CXL, I don't recall really placing a high emphasis on SEO.
No, I don't. I would agree with you. I think, a lot of the times we were talking over like coffee or a beer and you're like, oh, I read this book. And so I'm going to write, like it inspired me to write this piece. And then I do think we weren't like, I don't think we were negligent. We did like after the fact, maybe look and see, okay, what keywords can I, position myself well for, but it wasn't the heart of the article.
It didn't drive the content strategy. I think we can certainly say that. So I'm trying to do a retrospective here. What did drive the content strategy? Like, how did we come up with ideas? And like, once we had those ideas, how did we push those into action? I loved your explanation of your process of going through that. But like, where did you get content ideas?
I got them from what I was learning. I often felt like I was learning something and then the next week I would write an article on it. And I think a couple of times since working at CXL, people have come up to me and said, so great that like you had all of this knowledge that you were sharing with us. I was like, no, I just got that. And then I wrote about it in the way that I wished that like was accessible to me instead of going to all of these different places and all of these different sources and, you know, doing the reflection on what I'm learning and putting it in a good format or an accessible format. That's what I tried to do. And I think the only like tripwire I had was I told you and Pep what kind of topics I was thinking of, and I think maybe he vetoed a couple. But other than that, it was kind of just what I was learning and what I was interested in.
So this is super interesting. Just trying to reverse engineer this here, because CXL's content strategy was effective in many ways, that you can decouple from SEO, because it kind of did buck that trend that there's an animals blog post of your blog should be a library, not a publication. But I think in many ways, CXL did succeed in building a publication. And I think that was because of, not in spite of, our lack of SEO insistence. So what you said was sort of like my friend was talking the other day about career advice, and she says like this idea of follow your passion is bullshit. What you should actually do is follow your curiosity. And I thought about that longer, and I think that's cool, because what we did, I think, was totally follow our curiosity. Like I started reading books on, I read all of Nassim Taleb's books, and those give me a million ideas. I read Thinking Fast and Slow, and that gave me a million more ideas. And then, just blog posts and community threads and whatever else. And then it was sort of like a tributary, like the river would kind of splinter off. And like, I would talk to Matt Gershoff about something on like statistics, and he would mention, oh yeah, there's also this idea that like, in the 1920s was a very popular methodology. And I'll be like, well, shit, I kind of want to learn about that now. And like, it was this really cool path where I think our incentives at the company were aligned with our natural curiosities. And I guess like, I'm trying to weave this into a retrospective narrative, which is like, management wise, it seems like Pep accidentally was very effective, or maybe not accidentally, but he kind of let us just learn what we wanted to learn and get paid to do so by writing about it. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think so. Especially when you were talking about, you'd then take something and discuss it with Matt, and then you would find 7 other things you wanted to explore. I felt very similarly of like, I would take something to Talia Wolf or Joe from Copy Hackers, and they would be like, oh yeah, this is similar to this. And then I would go down that rabbit hole. Or like, one of my favorite articles I wrote to this day is the one when I learned about buyer modalities. And then I like dug into that and realized it was just based on Myers-Briggs. And then I was like talking to Pep, and he was like, Myers-Briggs is totally made up. And then I did like research on that. And then I wrote this entire article just like tearing apart the buyer modalities because Myers-Briggs is made up. And it made like a lot of people angry.
I was going to say, I remember that one being controversial.
Yeah. And I still can't believe he just like let me spend so much time researching this and then publishing it when, lots of people have given talks and stuff on the buyer modalities and written books on them. And I feel like he definitely let us follow our curiosity and kind of figure out, for better or worse, where that led us.
Yeah, it's interesting because like looping back to the first question I asked you, which was like, what do you miss about CXL? Now, I think if I ask myself that, it would be that just kind of like winding path of following your curiosity, which I've gotten in moments at different companies that I've worked for, but never fully, because you're incentivized on like not necessarily short-term goals, but you do have metrics that you've got to hit. You've got to like basically focus your energies, and like there's a little less of this like dilettante exploration. And I actually feel like I'm recapturing some of this through the work of the agency. So literally what I'm doing right now is I'm asking you all of the questions that I am naturally curious about. And I'm, kind of getting paid to do it in a way. Like, this is indirect because eventually some people may, listen to the podcast and respect me as an expert and hire me. But it's like, I think that's something that, if I could design my ideal life, I would carve out more time for, is just naturally following that path of curiosity.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is like the concept of two thoughts. I think is also the concept of being bored is like deeply rooted in this idea of like, when you are just free to do whatever you want and you have no constraints and you're just like following your interests, or you're following what is stimulating you right now, you end up in points of genius. And I also think like what initially drew me to Shopify was that like wide open space It's a bigger company now than when I started, but when I started, it was the biggest company I had ever worked for. And I was excited that they didn't prescribe what you should be doing. Like, I remember my first 2 weeks of working there, I kept going to my lead being like, what am I supposed to be doing? And he was like, just meet people and like figure out what you're interested in and you can do that. I'm like, but what do you mean? Like, what article is due? And he's like, no articles are due. So I think a lot of that energy, despite all of the growth at Shopify, is still alive. And I think that's very exciting. I think that the short-term goals and like being in the like more leadership positions are challenging me in an interesting way. But I also love that space is still available at such a large company.
It's going to be hard for the company to maintain that. I hope they do. I know that's something that with increasing size and scope and specialization, like that does become very difficult to let people just like have a playground. Yeah. But I love that. And it resonates with my early experience at HubSpot as well. The leadership stuff though is interesting because I think though it may be a little more constrained, like I know you're dealing with this and I'm also dealing with this. It feels mundane right now, but I actually think this may be something we look back on in a couple of years and say like, wow, that actually was one of those, CXL moments that we didn't think was like changing the career trajectory. But in retrospect, I actually did learn a ton and those constraints forced me in this direction that, resulted in this career change.
Yeah, I totally agree. When I joined Shopify because I had got a beer with Cassandra Campbell, who's currently the senior experimentation and analysis lead. And at the time she ran the content marketing team at Shopify. And so I grabbed a beer with her and I decided that I wanted to work for her. And that's why I joined Shopify. And I think what is so interesting about kind of following a person is that you get to like keep those spaces open, right? Like if you find people who appreciate that space and want to create it for you, then they can help you keep them open and they can help keep that curiosity open. But also it's been interesting on the leadership side of, I was kind of resistant for a while about being a people lead. I didn't know if I wanted to do it. I had tried it at previous companies. I was like a, air quotes director of marketing. It was a very small company, a very inflated title. But I did manage a few people and I didn't enjoy it. And so I was very nervous about doing it at Shopify, and Cassandra really encouraged me to try it. And I ended up loving it. And it feels like a completely different set of challenges. And it feels like a shift from where I've spent the vast majority of my career, in a way that I maybe wasn't really expecting. I didn't think it was going to change that much, but I'm excited about it. And I think that you're right. It probably is the closest I felt to feeling like this is one of those moments of great change.
So with that note, can I ask a couple more like broad career goal questions?
Yeah.
So you said on a different podcast that I listened to during my extensive research phase for this podcast that initially you wanted to be a CMO, and that goal has changed for you.
Yes, definitely.
So it's a funny story before I ask the question, but when I got beers with, Pep and Ben and the CRO meetup the other day, Pep told me that I once told him the same thing, like that apparently I also had the same goal. And I also no longer want that. So it's kind of fast. I don't even remember saying that, but apparently I also used to want to be a CMO. So why do you think you initially wanted to be a CMO, and why do you think that goal changed? And what do you want to do now?
I actually thought about this the other day because like a really old inconsequential account that I had, one of the secret questions was, what was your dream job as a kid? And my answer was CMO. And I was like, what? Like, what? When did I ever have this dream? I think like when I was thinking about my big life goals, I was like 14, 15 when I started getting into marketing, in like a meaningful way and not just reading about it anymore. And I think that my teenage brain just thought, marketing meets you're really, really good at it. And you're like
what's the top level I can essentially reach here? Yeah.
Right. Like, I think it was just marketing plus ambition. And also in working at smaller companies, a lack of understanding of what a CMO would be at a like sizable company. And now, working at Shopify, even Shopify 4 years ago, if I'm thinking about, I wouldn't have wanted to be the CMO of that size company either. It just is, it's a very different role. And I love the leadership aspect of it. I love the strategy aspect of it, but I also love the craft and I love implementation. And I would never want to go beyond the point where I'm like completely not shipping anymore, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's something that, I mean, for me, and it sounds like for you, when you think about this, it's not completely tangible, like how you can describe like why you don't want it. But I did this exercise where I thought like, all right, 5 years from now, I'm a VP marketing, CMO, whatever. Like, how much happier am I? And then I thought about like a contrary path, which is like, if I'm a founder or something like that, how happy am I? And just like based on the pure emotional like feeling, I just like, analyzed how my body felt, how my emotions felt in that moment. It was immediately clear to me that the CMO thing was not what I wanted to do. It's like, yeah, maybe like it would be marginally more interesting than what I'm doing now. Maybe not, who knows? But when I thought about the founder path, I'm like, oh, that makes my eyes light up. That's crazy. Like, I just feel like so much more excitement when I think about it like that. So I guess like, do you have any big milestones or like where you're kind of heading now? Or like, do you have any ideas of that? Like, what would that be for you? That, founder path for me, essentially.
Yeah, I think probably fairly similar to what you're thinking. Like, I love what I'm doing at Shopify. Would like to continue kind of improving at the things that I'm doing there and learning there, and continue like refining my craft, which I think is a big part of it. Like, I really love education, despite not really pursuing it in a formal way. And so I think I realized that I want to make a lot of space for continuing to learn and grow. So I take a lot of courses still. I'm in the middle of a front-end development course. So I'm trying to learn how to code.
Damn.
I'm also taking like stats courses. I read a lot of textbooks. Like, those are the things that make me really happy. And then I do eventually want to start a business. I don't know what kind of business, but I still think that it's kind of like a similar model to what you have of like a side gig, or not a side gig, but on top of a day job, more or less.
So if
I also would like to write a book.
I was just going to ask that. That's amazing. I literally wrote this down as a note. I said, I could see you writing a book one day. Have you thought about that? So it sounds like you've thought about that.
Yes. Yeah. I would love to write a book, nonfiction, but I don't have a great idea yet. And so I'm still thinking about it.
That's definitely in my pipeline as well. We're thinking about one for the agency, but still it's in the amorphous, nebulous stage right now. So it sounds like if you had $100 million plus, what you would do is you would read a shitload, write a shitload, and tinker on some business projects. Is that about right?
Basically, yeah.
That's essentially what I would do too. Because I've had this exercise. I've thought about this so much. Like, all right, if money wasn't an issue, like completely devoid of the imperative to work, what would I do? It's like probably just code, tinker, learn some new skills. Like, definitely read and write quite a bit more than I do now. Probably more books, but. Yeah, it'd be really interesting. And like, I feel like the business ideas that I would come up with there would be less practical, so to speak. Like, it probably wouldn't be like an agency or a software company. It would probably be like something I'm super interested in, like experiential stuff. Like, I love retreats, like ice baths, saunas. Like, how could I build a business like that? I don't even know what the answer would be, but it's kind of an interesting thought exercise.
Yeah, you would be fantastic at that. I feel like you excelled in your CXL Live, like host
VP party
socializing. Yeah,
that's what Pep would always say. This is management advice for anyone listening. If you can't pay them more, make them feel important. That's a direct quote from Pep, and he called me the VP of pre-party and made me just organize the event. Essentially, those are fun days. So, is there somebody you're chasing? Like, do you look ahead and think like, I want to, model myself after that person?
I don't think so, which is kind of an interesting question. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but like maybe 7-10 years ago, I was thinking of like people like Talia Wolf, Joe from Copy Hackers, Pep even. But I think not so much. I think the older that I'm getting, the more I'm realizing that, like, while I do love what I do, I'm a lot more interested in terms of like progression in the things outside of work. Like, I'm really happy with where I'm at with work and career. And I'm kind of at a point where I'm looking at what is developing the rest of my life look like. And so it's harder to get people's point of view on that from like Twitter. So I don't know exactly how to emulate or who I would look up to in that regard.
Yeah, no, this is a very frustrating transition I'm going through as well. You can't read as many blog posts on it. It's much more soft and squishy, which I love that word too, squishy. Yeah. So do you mind if I ask a couple rapid fire questions?
No.
So I guess this is related, but a little bit more concrete and less grandiose. But who do you admire professionally and why?
Okay, can I answer two people?
Yeah, for sure.
Does that break the rapid fire rules? Okay.
Yeah, totally.
I would say Cassandra Campbell, who is currently my lead at Shopify. We've worked together for a number of years, and I think that she's really embodied what I love about like being a great leader, but then also having like this deep technical ability and really like honing your craft continuously. So definitely look up to her. And then I would say Jonathan Volk is still a mentor and like personal hero of mine. He was, when I was 15, we met on a forum about massive multiplayer online chatting communities. And he kind of gave me my first opportunity to really learn about marketing. And he ended up being one of my references when I applied at Shopify, and is still, he's running like an e-commerce business now, but he's still someone I feel really shaped how I look at career and life. And I still really look up to him.
That's awesome. If you could create your own category in Jeopardy, what would it be? And what, would you get every question right?
It would definitely be reality TV. And I would definitely get every question right.
What kind of reality TV do you like?
I like all reality TV. I love all of the Real Housewives. I watch Survivor. I watch Big Brother. I watch all the TLC shows, Vanderpump Rules, 90 Day Fiance. I watch way too much TV. I should have put that in my hobbies category. Sorry.
This is amazing. I never knew this about you.
It's bad. The worse the show, the more I like it.
Oh, I love that.
F-Boy Island. Have you seen that? It's so bad.
Is this on Netflix?
I think it's on HBO.
All right. I've got to dip my toes into this. F-Boy Nation, like Fuckboy Nation.
Yeah, I think that maybe they didn't know what network was going to pick it up, so they went with F-Boy instead. Yeah.
Right. But I get the concept.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. All right. So here's a question just for you. Which, do you have a favorite punk rock or emo song?
I think, despite the fact that I think the band is a little problematic, I think I have to go with I Believe You, But My Tommy Gun Doesn't by Brand New, because I have part of the lyrics tattooed on my body. So I feel like I have to say that one. What
happened with Brand New?
They have some sexual assault allegations against them.
Oh shit. I didn't even know that. I used to love Brand New back in the day.
I'm like, ugh.
You're like, no, this is a tattoo.
Yeah.
Oh my God. But I mean, some of those lyrics are just, you can't get them out of your head.
It's so, and anytime I meet someone who is like very into emo and punk, actually Joe Martin, when we were hanging out one time, he was like, I don't see a band tattoo. And then I explained the tattoo to him. He was like, that's genius. It's so good.
That's awesome.
Only people from.
Did you know I met Joe through basically punk rock and emo? Like we met at Warped Tour when he was managing a band in Chicago, and he was like walking around handing out CDs wearing a banana costume. I met him when I was like 14 or 15.
I did not know that. Is that how he started going to CXL? Because I met him telling ghost stories at CXL.
No, so I saw his name on the registrations and I was like, wait, I think I know this guy. And I looked it up and I was like, this is the same dude. What a small world.
That's hilarious. Joe's one of my favorite people I've met just randomly. And we've stayed in touch for so many years just because we were mildly drunk and trading ghost stories at CXL.
He is fantastic. I actually have a call with him today, oddly enough.
Nice.
So I'll tell him you said hi.
Thank you.
Which talent would you most like to have?
I would love to be able to paint or draw, or like be a tattoo artist would be very cool.
Do you dabble? Do you draw or do anything like that now?
I can draw a cat on a raft is like my go-to. I don't know why. I started drawing it in high school, and it's the only thing I've ever learned how to draw.
Yeah. So this is not a rapid fire question, but I have to ask. So I've always really admired like visual art. Like I kind of surround myself with it in my place. Like I always enjoyed going to museums when I would travel. But I have like, I would say that's probably my least developed skill is visual artistry. Like I can't draw myself. Even like on the CRO side, like I don't know how to design shit that well. Like I can kind of look and see like what bad UX is and do the research to figure it out. But when it comes to like even wireframing, I really struggle with that stuff. Mm-hmm. So because you wish you had the skill, it sounds like you don't draw or paint or anything. Do you think that's actually increased your admiration and respect for people who have that or like for visual art in general?
Absolutely. I mean, I put like no effort into developing the skill whatsoever, but in my head, I'm just like, this is monumental. You must be so talented. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that they are, but I think also like I don't have that same feeling about like musicians or writers, but I do specifically for visual arts. And so I think it's just because I lack it so completely.
Mine is, it's so interesting. You said music because I still admire musicians, but it's more like a craftsman and a virtuoso maybe. But with art, it's like magic. Like I can break down and understand even the most complex stuff, like maybe like a Radiohead song and think, oh, that's weird. You did that and really genius, but I get it. Whereas art, I'm like, no clue how you did that.
Yeah, exactly. And then you talk to someone who isn't, I have a lot of friends who are artists and they're like, you just start and then practice just like everything else that you've done in your life. I'm like, no, it's magic. There's something that happens that I just don't have and you do. And that's the only truth I can accept.
So brilliant segue into the next question here. Do you consider yourself more scientific or artistic?
I think I consider myself more artistic. I think that all of the scientific things that I've learned in like mathematics has been forced and has not necessarily come naturally to me. My like grade 10 math teacher told me that I should not take advanced functions in grade 11 because it was going to bring down my average and so that I should stick to the arts. So I think that that's probably my natural answer. And I've forced myself to learn the other parts.
Interesting. If you could have dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
Charlotte Bronte is my favorite author, and so I would choose her.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think, or what do you consider the most overrated virtue?
Patience.
Interesting. Tell me more.
I'm not very patient. I guess that's maybe the only Aries quality that I identify with. I think that there's something to be said about speed. I mean, there's like a million people who are not a million people because no one cares, but like people will come back and point to all of the times that I've tweeted about the long game and, being patient and making strategic decisions in your career. But I also think that there needs to be balance with like short-term speed, if that makes sense at all.
It does entirely make sense. I have struggled with patience forever. Even at HubSpot, like I would grind myself into circles. Like I would basically just like, I would be way too impatient with myself. And then my manager would be like, dude, chill, like calm down. Like we're all good. Like, cause I come from startup backgrounds where it was like, you really do have to like, pride yourself on speed. Otherwise the company dies. So now that I'm building my own company, we all are pretty impatient, but we've decided that we're going to be impatient with effort and patient with results. So I think it's pretty much what you said there. It's like play the long game, but definitely don't give up speed in terms of like how you're getting shit done to get there.
Right. I like that a lot. It's much more poetic than the way I put it.
Well, we've really had to like apply this as a therapeutic lens to our own, shortcomings with impatience. So thought a lot about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true also like in all areas of my life, I'm like always thinking that I should be further along or like, why am I not here? Or like, I'm just constantly racing against myself. And then when you kind of zoom out, you're like, oh, chill out. Like,
yeah, I'm
you're
good.
doing
this
great.
is fine.
Yeah.
That's another benefit to the journaling and reflection, by the way. Like I find that when I do journal in the morning and do gratitude journals, I tend to be able to see that like a higher level view. But when I don't, I get caught in the weeds and I feel like I'm constantly just like sprinting to race myself or something.
Right. Right.
What's a career choice that you considered but didn't pursue?
Okay, well, I have two. I considered going to law school. Like right before I dropped out of university, I had to do an analysis of like, do I want to be a lawyer? Because if so, I can't do this. And I decided not to go to law school because I didn't want to dress well. Which sounds like a joke, but is genuinely the reason I like was sure I wasn't going to law school. And then I think the second one that feels relevant is when I flew from the East Coast of Canada to Toronto to get a drink with Cassandra, who I eventually started working for at Shopify. I was actually in Toronto to interview at a different company. And they had like asked me to fly out and had like set up this whole dinner and everything. We were going to meet. And I ended up not choosing that and messaging Cassandra after being like, hey, is Shopify hiring? So that feels like also more relevant maybe than my almost law school story.
Yeah, for sure. That's really interesting because a lot of people will answer this with the law school type thing, but yours is actually very concrete, almost chose that path. The law school thing is also, I have a sneaking suspicion that anybody with a high degree of ambition who studied something in the humanities, so not necessarily engineering or mathematics, I have a suspicion that almost everybody with a degree of ambition in that area has thought about law school. I certainly did for a little bit.
Yeah. It also helped having an aunt. My aunt went to law school because she liked all of the law TV shows when she was a kid. And she was like, do not go to law school. And now I have one of my best childhood friends also went to law school. And she's like, you should be so glad you didn't go to law school. Like they're all looking for kind of what's next already.
We really glamorize it in media and a lot of like our folklore. I don't know if this is the reason I didn't pursue it. I think I had other converging factors in my life, such as the books I was reading and kind of ideas as to like what I could do. But I remember reading an article from Tucker Max in the Huffington Post that said like why you shouldn't go to law school. And he laid out every single argument or like every single reason people have for going to law school and just debunked everything about it. And I was like, oh, fuck. All right. Like this is a good argument against it. So kind of fascinating. Okay. One more easy one. What like blogs, podcasts, influencers have you been following recently that you've been enjoying?
I wish that I could remember the URL. My friend Moj, who used to work at Shopify, and she's now data at Wealthsimple, and she just launched a blog, and I cannot say enough good things about her. Maybe I can send you the URL when I remember it after. She like stayed after work and taught me SQL and like taught me so many things and was a big pillar of the data science portion of experimentation at Shopify. And I just like truly think she's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And she just started a blog. And so I like instantly subscribed and am so excited because I feel like since she's left Shopify, it's been a void in both my heart and my brain that I'm hoping this blog will fill.
Love it. All right, cool. So is there anywhere some people who want to find you online, anywhere you'd point them to?
Probably Twitter. I tweet a lot of nonsense, but it's the place that I'm most active. So it's just Shanelle_Mullin is my handle.
I like it. I like nonsense. Thank you so much, Shanelle. This was super fun.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we could catch up.